Hey guys, good to be back with you again. It's me again with one of these sort of boomer-esque posts that are going to get me criticized all over the place on Twitter, on Reddit, and all over the rest of social media. We're going to talk here a little bit about fanhood of baseball and the reason why we like watching the sport and why we consider ourselves to be fans. This is something I've been thinking about lately. Again, it's based on another post on one of our favorite Delphi forums that I was looking at, and it got me sort of to think a little bit when we talk about people of younger generations and whether they even care enough to watch the sport or if they're just interested in things like statistics and different things like that, or even if they're interested in that, they may have no interest at all in any of this. Who knows? How things have changed, and they've changed a lot, in my own lifetime. I mean, I remember as a child wanting to watch more baseball and being unable to do so, right? So when I was a kid, we didn't have cable television. I remember I was 6 years old in 1990. That's when I turned 6. That was the first year the CBS had the Major League Baseball contract, which meant that the old game of the week was gone. Monday Night Baseball was also gone on ABC. It was replaced by a CBS version of the game of the week that only covered, I think, like 12 weeks or 13 weeks in the regular season, right? I can remember as a child being upset because I couldn't watch baseball. I mean, you tune into CBS half the time, it would be some other stupid thing that they would put on instead. And how frustrating that was to not be able to have baseball without cable television. And it only got worse from there, as many of you remember, with the baseball network in 94 and 95 and all the ridiculousness that happened there. It wasn't really until Fox came along in 1996 that things really came back to broadcast television for those of us who didn't live in major league markets. And the worst thing about that we tend to forget is that the 1994 strike, which of course came in between, just totally destroyed people's interest in the game. I mean, I was, like 10 years old, and I had friends who had been into baseball before who had no interest in it anymore, and most of them never came back to watch the sport. I mean, the damage that was done by the strike in 94 was pretty big. And I think is easy to underestimate, but it was a major, major problem, and I think it still hurts the game today, even though it was almost 30 years ago. It's amazing. It's amazing how this stuff works. I've always been a fan, though, of the history of the game, and I credit a lot of that to my interest in games like APBA, Strat-O-Matic, and the rest, in helping me to sort of keep the idea of the history of baseball alive and give me some sort of interest into facets of the game that are maybe not connected directly to statistics, things like how the game not only was played, but how it was watched, and what it looked like, what players looked like, what their uniforms looked like, what time of game what time of day rather the games were played, and all of these other sort of trivial questions that have been lost, I think, mostly over time. There is a little bit of worry that I have, though, that all of this interesting stuff is going to end up being sort of swept away. I remember what the early message boards on the internet, baseball boards that is, looked like. I probably started visiting these Delphi forums sometime in the late 1990s. I don't have much memory of that, but I do remember that when I was a senior in high school back in 2001, I remember going to a website called Baseball Primer, which is now Baseball Think Factory, and which at the time was this great gathering place of all sorts of people who were interested in sabermetrics, people who were baseball historians, people who were interested in baseball simulators, people who were just fans of the game, and some people who later on would become quite famous and quite well known. And back then, there was this sort of smorgasbord of different types of people. I mean, you had people who were interested in baseball because of their gambling interests and addictions. There were people who were just interested in statistics in general, people who were interested in the business side of the game, people, like I said, who were interested in their particular team, or who were interested in the history of the sport or whatever. And then there were people like me, too, who I think we would categorize and quantify as or consider to be just sort of general baseball fans of the sport in general. And the unfortunate thing is that as I've seen things happen over time, I've seen sort of the general baseball fans fall by the wayside, and I've seen everything be replaced with an emphasis on fantasy baseball and on trying to get an edge and on statistical analysis, not necessarily for the sake of trying to figure out, how valuable or not valuable a player is, but rather statistical analysis with an emphasis on trying to predict what happens in the future for gambling purposes. And that's where things start to look a little bit sour, and that's where I feel like it really takes a bad turn. I really, really get upset about this. Just, I mean, even thinking about it, it's not that fantasy sports are bad, but the emphasis that we've had in recent years on gambling is something that I can't get into. I can't really, understand this. And I worry a lot about sort of what's happened with the game as a whole. There was a post on one of these message boards where somebody was saying they were talking to a family member who was much younger and saying that, are you interested in the fact that, such and such team is in the playoffs or whatever? And this younger family member said, well, not really, because there's nothing that's in it for me. Somebody else responded and said, well, that's a really rational way of thinking about it, right? There is nothing in it for you. Why would you care at all about, how your local team is doing and how they fare? And unfortunately, this is a point of view that I also understand very, very well. I was interested here in the Washington Nationals back in 2012. We actually were not living in this area back then. We were in China. I remember watching them in the postseason and watching them fall apart and lose that Game 5 in the NLDS to the Cardinals and being just devastated as a result. But over time, after a while, I started to ask myself why I cared so much. And over time, unfortunately, that sort of feeling of caring about the local team just sort of died off. I think it was Jerry Seinfeld who said at one point in time that rooting for a sports team is like rooting for laundry. And it really is true. You're rooting for a certain color. It's gotten to the point with player movement where it's hard to even remember who is on your team and who is not. And rosters become increasingly anonymous. And it especially affects teams like the Oakland Athletics that we've seen this year, who've already used 50-something players. And I mean, we're not even to the All-Star break yet. It's a problem. It really is a problem. And it's something that really needs to be talked about at some point in time. The more that I think the average fan is disconnected from the sport and feels like there's no connection to the team that represents the city, the worse off the team will fare. Now, we'll talk about all of this a little bit more later when we get more into the business side of the sport and exactly what's happening. But the truth is that baseball as a business is going to do extremely poorly if people in the local area simply don't care for the sport. I mean, fine, you might be able to convince, some boomer, boss who has his, private company worth however many millions or tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to sponsor your team or sponsor your stadium or whatever for a certain amount of time. But at some level, that money from that advertising revenue is going to dry up. You might be able to convince, the television network, the cable TV network, the sports network to own to broadcast your team's games and give you a certain amount of royalties. In fact, it might be easy to convince them to do that if you also own the television network. But at some point in time, the advertising money that comes into you for doing this is going to start drying up. And that's the big problem that you have to worry about. If the sport does not start to grow and does not start to attract a new audience in very, very large numbers and large terms, then you have a problem. And I think the biggest problem you have to ask yourself really is sort of the what's in it for me. Now, I can tell you what's in it for me when it comes to playing a simulation, when it comes to playing these games and putting them on camera and stuff like that. It's a lot of fun, right? This is sort of my own world. This is sort of my own way of doing it. I can create it the way that I want. I can craft it a certain way. I can see it all in my mind, right? It's a lot of fun, and it exists sort of in my own head. But I'm going to be honest with you, in the evenings, I don't sit down and watch a baseball game. It's the last thing in the world that I want to do. If I'm going to do anything involving the sport, I'm going to go blog about it. I'm going to go read what somebody has to say about it. I'm going to play another game off camera or do something like that, right? This is the problem, right? This is the problem with the sport, because if people like me are not actively consuming the sport, and I would consider myself to be a very rabid baseball fan, then how in the world does the sport expect to survive? I mean, at some point in time, somewhere in the economic plan, somebody has got to be the origin point. Somewhere there has to be some sort of customer. Absent the customer, there's, no point to doing any of it at all. Anyway, there's a couple of my sort of gloom and doom thoughts. I'd be interested to know what you have to think about that, and I'll talk with you tomorrow. Bye-bye.